Ida B. Wells was a powerful leader who pushed against racism and violence against people of color. In the years after Reconstruction, it was hard for African Americans in the South to vote. By 1900, all Southern states had put in place new rules that made it harder for black people to vote. One of these rules was the literacy test, in which respondents had to show that they could read. Unfortunately, the tests for black voters were often much harder than those for white voters. The judges could give people a pass or a fail as they saw fit. There was also the poll tax, which was a fee people had to pay to vote. Many poor African Americans and whites couldn't pay this tax, so they couldn't vote. Some Southern states put in place a grandfather clause so that poor or illiterate white people could still vote. This section said that anyone could vote if their father or grandfather had been able to vote before January 1st, 1867. Before that date, freed slaves didn't have the right to vote, so this rule kept African Americans from being able to vote. Even though there were challenges, the Supreme Court ruled that literacy tests and poll taxes were valid. In the South, segregation by race was accepted, and Jim Crow laws kept whites and blacks apart in public and private places. The famous Plessy v. Ferguson case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which said that people of different races could be separated in public places. The separate but equal doctrine was set up by this ruling. African Americans had to deal with both unfair rules and customs that limited their rights and kept them from being treated equally. African Americans had to show whites respect by giving up the sidewalk and taking off their hats when they saw white people. Reformers like Booker T. Washington pushed for equality to happen gradually through economic freedom, while Webb Du Bois and Ida B. Wells pushed for equality to happen right away. If you didn't follow these rules, you could face harsh punishments, like being hung without a hearing. In the North, discrimination continued in the form of segregated areas and bias at work. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, Mexicans who worked in the West and Southwest were treated badly. Railroad companies hired them to build train lines in the Southwest, which is hot and dry. Because of how poor they were, their wages were often lower than those of workers from other ethnic groups. Mexicans were also very important to the mining and farming businesses in the Southwest because they did most of the work that was needed. Unfortunately, they were sometimes used as slaves by landowners who made them work to pay off their bills. This was called debt peonage. But in 1911, the Supreme Court said that this was against the 13th Amendment and put an end to it. In the same way, Chinese workers in America were also treated badly. Many white workers were afraid that Chinese workers would take their jobs, so Chinese areas and schools were kept separate. These unfair practices made it harder for Mexican and Chinese workers to get jobs, which shows how hard things were for them at the time.